Hello, apes, and welcome to screencast number 2 for Chapter 7, Environmental Policy, Making Decisions and Solving Problems. So we left off and I said we were going to talk about the tragedy of the commons, and this is going to be an activity that we're going to do in the beginning of the school year. So you need to file this in the back of your mind for that activity because I think it'll help and make it a little bit more interesting. I'm going to read a paragraph from your textbook about the tragedy of the commons. It says, when publicly accessible resources are open to unregulated exploitation, they tend to become overused and as a result are damaged or depleted. So argued environmental scientist Garrett Hardin in his 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons. Basing his argument on an age-old scenario, Hardin explained that in public pasture or common, open to unregulated grazing, each person who grazes animals will be motivated by self-interest to increase the number of his or her animals in the pasture. Because no single person owns the pasture, no one has incentive to expend effort in taking care of it. Instead, each person takes what he or she can until the resource is depleted and overgrazing causes the pasture's food production to collapse. This is known as the tragedy of the commons. So the idea of this is that you've got this open area that anybody can use to feed their cattle, or as he said in this example, and that they keep bringing in more and more cattle so that by the time it's all done, all of the grass has been fed on and there's no more grass. Well, what's going to happen? The cattle aren't going to be able to get food, and these people that brought it to the commons, they're not going to be able to make money off their cattle because they'll be dying out, and it causes just this domino effect of problems. So we see this within forests, we see it within fisheries, big time within the ocean with overfishing of the ocean, grazing land, clean air, and clean water. So traditionally, societies try to safeguard against that overuse, against that exploitation. And instead, they have a cooperative approach where the policies are put into place, the users are going to follow those policies so that they can take care of that resource. They have also done things like privatization, where they keep that property area private and that nobody else can use it but that person who has it. We have a problem with privatization because it doesn't always work for air and water. I mean, we all share the air. There's no way to cordon off that air. So that becomes a problem, in the water and the ocean waters, that falls under the same category. So what this leads to is public oversight through the government, and it's often used, as I said, with these policies in place. So public oversight involves restrictions of use and management, and this is one of the standard ways to alleviate the tragedy of the commons, but it doesn't really address the dilemma that exists with the overuse. There is a bottom-up cooperative approach that users of the resources band together and they cooperate to prevent overexploitation. There are, in traditional societies over the centuries, they developed ways to manage resources cooperatively and sustainably with the community. Another approach, as we said, is that privatization approach. And this is where the resource is subdivided and allotments are sold into private ownership so that each owner has an incentive to conserve his or her own portion of the resource to maximize the productivity. The cooperative approach often works, and privatization may work, but many cases will still move to public oversight and regulation by that democratic government. And that seems so far the best way to avoid any over exploitation. So if you read your book, you read something about free riders. And free riders I'm hesitating here. I'll read from this. Okay, free riders is like one entity, a business, a factory, or whatever, that does not participate in a voluntary effort to improve the environment. So they don't participate in reducing, let's say, pollution. They avoid the sacrifices made by others, and they get a free ride. So let's say that a community on a river suffers from water pollution that emanates from 10 different factories. The problem could, in theory, be solved if every factory voluntarily agreed to reduce its own pollution. Once they all begin reducing their pollution, it becomes tempting for any of them to stop doing this. The factory that avoids the efforts that the others are making would, in essence, get a free ride. If enough factories take a free ride, the whole enterprise will collapse because the free ride problem, private voluntary efforts are often less effective than the efforts mandated by public policy. So that becomes a problem that is faced. Then there's external costs, and environmental policy also aims to promote fairness by dealing with external costs, the harmful impacts suffered by people not involved in the actions that created them. For example, a factory might reap greater profits by discharging waste into a river instead of paying for the proper waste disposal or recycling. Its actions, however, impose external costs. Water pollution, reduced fish population, are examples. The aesthetic probably creates an odor, degradation, and other problems on the downstream users. Natural gas drilling, like we saw, pollute groundwater and cause earthquakes and may impose external cost on people that live nearby. So these are what they mean by external costs, these harmful impacts of the market transactions that are borne by the people not involved in the transaction. So these external costs came up with the idea of polluter pays principle. And this is a principle that specifies that the polluters cover the cost of the impacts. So like if there was that BP oil spill, then the people at BP, they're responsible for covering the cost of the impacts. This addresses misuse of common resources, free riders, since all polluters will pay, and then all external cost would be covered. So in this picture, what you are seeing is this is a resident of Dimock, and she is Patricia Farnelli, and she's holding polluted road runoff water from a fracking activity that is located on her land. Look at how dark that water is. Okay, so there's a couple of different things that can get in the way of environmental policy, and one of those is that people continue to challenge environmental laws, or they ignore environmental laws, or companies will challenge them, or they're rejected by the citizens and the policymakers. So environmental policy involves government regulations, and these government regulations apply to property owners, to business people, and property owners and business people think that these regulations a lot of times are either overly restrictive, they're bureaucratic, or they're costly. And somebody's going to have to absorb that cost, and usually it is the consumer. Problems develop gradually in our environment, and they happen over the long term. So when we consider human behavior, the way that they look at things is just taking care of short-term needs, not the long-term needs. So right now we're talking about the big thing is global warming. And I see Al Gore has a new movie out, a continuation of his Inconvenient Truth, and we're hopefully going to be watching Leonardo DiCaprio's movie Before the Flood, which I think you're going to find very interesting. And this global climate change that's happening, it's long term, and it's part of the natural evolutionary process of the Earth, but the presence of 7 billion people on the planet are speeding up the process. So there are people that are looking for just short-term solutions so that our children and their children will have to worry about it. And businesses tend to go for short-term solutions as well, because they want to have that economic gain. And even the news media. There's so much negative talk about the news media, but they do tell you what they want you to hear. And they tell you what they want you to hear to manipulate your thinking. And they know that the public has short attention spans. They know that the public will forget how frustrated they felt after some time passed. So, and that's a large portion of the public that will feel that way. And because of that, politicians will act out on the short-term interests. So that idea of the long-term problem never really gets resolved because of that. So, where do the interests lie? And we've got two different groups of thinking, and these are vested interests and lobbying. So vested interest is a special interest shown by people and organizations or corporations that stand to benefit from the policy. So if I, say that we're not going to have fracking in western Pennsylvania, and I develop a policy because I'm going to use that land for something else, then I'm going to develop a policy that's going to benefit my use. It's going to serve my own interest, not society's interest, and it frequently has the most influence over policymakers. So one of the things that we will be talking about is that there are groups like big oil groups that have their hands in government because they make a lot of contributions. So because they make a lot of contributions, the policies that they ask the policymakers to make are in their favor for that. Lobbying, on the other hand, is where you're spending time or money to influence an elected official's decision. So anyone can lobby. It's easier for a professional to be a lobbyist to gain access because they can get in to talk to the politicians more easily. Industries wishing to change policy, they'll invest millions of dollars in lobbying efforts to get the politicians on their side. There was a movie, The American President. They were lobbying against the big automotive companies, and they were putting millions of dollars into these efforts. We're running out of time. We'll see you in the next screencast.